Hi, Sergey. How you doing?
Hi, Adam.
Good. Are you in, I thought you were going to be in an airport cafe or something, you said.
Well, yeah, it's much more dramatic. So I flew into Lisbon this morning from
Uh,
DC, and I had a
oh,
connecting flight, but the passport control was so long. I stood in the passport control for like 3 hours. So
oh
by
my
the time
God.
I got to my next flight, well, it was gone. And the options were either take the next flight, which is now, but then I would have to
Oh,
cancel
yeah,
my
yeah.
talk, or stay overnight in Lisbon, which since I promised to do the talk, I thought, okay, might as well just stay overnight in Lisbon. And I'll fly tomorrow
Oh, yeah,
morning.
yeah. It's
Go to
such
Lisbon
a
tomorrow
hassle.
morning.
Sorry to hear about that. Is this because they're
Where,
checking everybody's vaccine papers or something? 3 hours?
no, well, I don't know what's going on. But here, okay, so here's a complication. I'm not sure to what
Mm.
extent this is, how we're going to.
We're recording, but we're going to cut that off anyway. I think it's the tech person who set this up to start. We'll cut off this at the beginning of the talk in any case. So. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay. No, what I have to do is I have to check because there is the internet connection in the hotel is faulty. It's not working.
Mhm.
So I'm connecting via 4G. I'm worried that I'll run out of data because I'm roaming. So
Oh,
I have to check how much data I have. I'm just checking
I
I'm
mean,
just going into.
I mean, if you want to use the hotel, I mean, does it just cut out occasionally, or is it a speed question, or what? Because I mean,
It just
we can
doesn't
let people
work.
know,
I
and then
don't
we
know.
can adjust the recording afterwards if necessary.
I have no idea. So I will just check how much data I have on my account. I mean, it really shouldn't be, Zoom doesn't take that much data, I don't think. I just need to check how much data I have. So if I get cut off, you know what happened. But I am able to transfer data to the account. So
Okay. I mean, we can fiddle around with the recording anyway to remove that,
okay,
because I
so
think at this time, it probably most people watching it are going to be watching it recorded, given the times, like in the US and
yeah,
everything else.
yeah.
So.
Okay, well, it looks like I'm almost out of data, so I'll just transfer some data to
Okay.
myself. So this way we won't,
Okay.
I won't cut myself out.
Okay.
So hang on. Uh, oh. Hmm. Okay. All right. Hopefully it will be enough.
Okay.
I don't.
Well, we'll deal with it
Know.
as we need to.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, it's I'm always on the move, so as you are.
No,
So
I
it's
I
just
can relate to that.
you kind of plan things out, and then some things happen inadvertently. Like who would have thought that I'd spent 3 hours at passport control. Yeah, if I had known, they said, "Oh, we'll call you out, or we'll call out flights." Of course, they didn't, and then they. So anyway.
Yeah,
right. Okay.
I had one of my interventions at one of the SAIS leadership meetings, I think, was standing by a car on the phone, actually, because various circumstances. So it's part of the course, I guess.
Well, look, we're global. We're, what is that called in Chinese? 黄球人物, very global people.
Yeah.
So therefore.
Okay, so I think we started recording. We'll cut the previous stuff off in any case, and we'll start now. Okay, welcome everyone, whether you're at HNC in Nanjing or SAIS Europe or SAIS DC or scattered anywhere else around the world. So we're very lucky today as a lecture in our Friday lecture series to have Sergey Radchenko joining us. He's the Wilson E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor at SAIS Europe in Bologna, Italy, our sister campus. He's written extensively on the Cold War, nuclear history, Russian and Chinese foreign and security policies. He's also served as a global fellow and a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. And he spent time in China teaching at East China Normal University. His books include Two Suns in the Heavens, The Sino-Soviet Struggle for Supremacy in 2009, and Unwanted Visionaries, The Soviet Failure in Asia in 2014. He comes from Russia and was educated in the US, Hong Kong, and the UK. And previously he was teaching at the University of Cardiff in Wales. Last time I saw Professor Radchenko was actually at a pub in Somerset in England in the summer. And he's also a member of the HNC Joint Academic Committee, so he's quite familiar with HNC. So we're very happy to have him here joining us today for his talk, Mongolia, Can It Survive?, which is an apt topic for someone looking at Sino-Soviet and Sino-Russian historical and political issues. We are recording this. I realize given the time zones, probably most people watching this will be watching the recorded version. I should also say at the outset, Professor Radchenko is something of a global nomad. So he's, I think, in Lisbon at the moment. He was having a bit of an issue with the internet connection. So if we have any tech issues, we will deal with those as they come up, and then we'll correct that in the recorded version as well. So, Professor Radchenko, welcome.
Thank you, Adam. Really appreciate your kind remarks. And yes, this is, it's great to be able to connect like this from anywhere in the world, despite all the contingencies of planning or unplanned occurrences. As in this case, I find myself in Lisbon quite actually unexpectedly to talk about Mongolia. Will Mongolia survive? What a provocative title. I deliberately made it provocative. What I meant two things. I mean, first of all, can Mongolia survive just merely as a country? And you might think, well, what is the problem? What would happen to Mongolia? Where would it go? And the answer will hopefully become clear through my presentation. I don't think it will go anywhere anytime soon, but there are some interesting questions about Mongolian identity, Mongolian presence between its two giant neighbors, China and Russia. Is it secure? Is it insecure? What threats are out there that Mongolia is dealing with in terms of its threats to its national security? So that's one part of the question: can Mongolia or will Mongolia survive? The second part of the question is, and on the first part of the question, I'll just say outright, I think probably it's not an issue at the moment, and going forward, I think Mongolia is pretty secure in this regard. The second part of the question is, really, can Mongolia survive as is, that is, a democratic country? And this is a more complicated question. That is a complicated question because Mongolia is indeed a rare phenomenon in Central Asian, Inner-Asian politics. Practically every other country there in that region is basically, either a hideous tyranny or a very unstable regime. And by unstable, I mean, for example, Kyrgyzstan, that has experienced this coup after revolution after coup, etc. We have not seen that in Mongolia. Mongolia, since 1990, has been actually fairly stable in its democratic development. I don't mean to say that Mongolia is stable, rather as a perfect democracy, because there's so many problems there, but it is nevertheless correct to say that it is no longer a democracy in transition. In other words, after you've had a democratic system of governance for 30 years, more than 30 years, you're basically accustomed to this system of governance. But there are serious challenges, not least the fact that Mongolia is locked in perpetually between its two neighbors. One of them is, basically a tyranny. The other is a strong authoritarian, strongly authoritarian system. I won't say which one is which. Anyway, both have problems, right? Mongolia, locked between those two, it finds itself in a very difficult, between the rock and the hard place. To what extent will China and Russia attempt to influence Mongolian politics? To what extent will they put up with Mongolian democracy such as it is? That is a big unanswered question. So I will structure my talk as follows. I will have 3 parts to it. In the first part of the talk, I will address historical issues going back almost, well, more than 100 years, really, to the dawn of Mongolia's independence. It'll become clear why I want to do that in the course of my discussion. I'll spend maybe 10-15 minutes doing that. The second part will focus on Mongolia's domestic politics in the last 30 or so years. And then in the third part of the discussion today, I will focus in particular on Mongolia's foreign policy and its relationship between Mongolia and its 2 neighbors, China and Russia. So those are the 3 parts of the talk, which will probably take about 45 minutes, and then we can have a little discussion if need be, or if not, we'll save my data and call it a day. So to start at the beginning, Mongolia proclaimed independence from China in 1911. So this year marked already 110 years since Mongolia has broken out from under Chinese control. Now, well, this is a complicated story, of course, as maybe some of you would know. Collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911 allowed Mongolian aristocracy to do that, to proclaim independence from China, but proclaiming independence from China did not lead in the short term to any real independence. That is because this kind of independence also hinged on foreign recognition, on Mongolia's own ability to defend this independence, which was not necessarily forthcoming. So for the first few years after proclaiming independence, Mongolia was looking around for support. Mongolian aristocracy were looking around for support among foreign powers. Russia was neither here nor there. Of course, Russia had extensive commercial interests in Mongolia. That allowed then Russia to exert its influence in Mongolia and helped assure Mongolia's autonomy from Chinese rule, to which as an agreement was signed between the 3 parties: China, Imperial Russia, and Mongolia. But Russia exited the scene briefly with the chaos of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution, which allowed the Chinese to reestablish their control, their political control and their military control for a few years, until the anti-communist, anti-revolutionary adventurist, highly anti-Semitic as well, adventurist Baron Ungern went into Mongolia in 1921 and ousted the Chinese forces. This was part of his big bid for creating some kind of a anti-communist anti-communist empire or anti-communist state in the heart of Asia. But Baron Ungern's adventures came to a very sad end shortly thereafter, because Russian Bolshevik revolutionary forces went after him into Mongolia, were able to effectively chase him out. He was arrested, executed, and from that point, i.e. from 1921, the Soviets basically became quite entrenched in Mongolia, and Mongolia was effectively lost to China's actual influence. Yeah, the Chinese were basically ousted from Mongolia. And after that, from 1921 and until, well, 1990, Mongolia developed as a de facto Soviet satellite. That is to say, it followed the Soviet Union on the road to revolutionary transformation, construction of socialism, bloody purges. Tens of thousands of Buddhist clergy were massacred at Soviet behest, with participation of Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, who were, the Soviet clients in Mongolia. The Soviets, rather the Mongolian leadership, communist leadership, implemented pretty much the same system as that which existed in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, which was Stalinist system with its own Stalin, someone called Marshal Choibalsan, Horlogin Choibalsan, who modeled himself after Stalin. Now, those Mongolian leaders who did not like this or did not follow that particular orientation or tried to maintain some independence from the Soviets were ruthlessly eliminated. Two Mongolian prime ministers, including Prime Minister Genden and Prime Minister Amar, were both arrested and executed in the Soviet Union. Then, of course, throughout the Second World War, Choibalsan, as the Soviet client in Mongolia, effectively closely followed the Soviet Union. Comes 1945, which is a very interesting year. So 1945, if you can imagine what is happening in Asia, Japan is defeated. As a result, there's power vacuum. In China, there is a movement of two major forces, the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party. There's a prospect that a civil war will break out between the two of them, following the breakdown of the Second United Front, which seemed very likely at this point. But Soviet leader Stalin at that point did not want this to happen. He did not want a civil war to begin in China. He had reached an agreement with American President Roosevelt in Yalta, in Crimea, in February 1945 about Soviet gains in Asia and in the aftermath of the Second World War, which would include, crucially, Mongolia's independence. This was presented as status quo. Roosevelt didn't ask what status quo meant. It didn't really matter. Who cares? Mongolia is far away. Nobody knows what's going on there. So status quo, that sounds good. The Soviets also got effective American endorsement of their claims to naval base in China in Dalian or Lushenko, and also to the railroad, which they had previously sold to the Japanese. They wanted the railroad back. They got the Kuril Islands and southern half of Sakhalin from Japan. So Stalin got some sizable things. All of those were endorsed by Roosevelt in the context of the Yalta Agreement of 1945. Crucially, this included Mongolia. As I mentioned, Mongolia was really the prize for Stalin. It says here, internet connection is unstable. How are we doing? Can I still be heard?
It seems to be okay. I mean, the
Yes.
speed's not ideal, but we can hear you fine.
I'm getting, okay, so that's fine. So anyway, to make a long story short, Stalin did not want a civil war to break out in China between the communists and the Kuomintang, because he really wanted some sort of almost, coalition government, which would allow degree of Soviet influence over China. But what he really wanted was Soviet gains to be recognized by the Yalta within the context of the Yalta framework, including, of course, Mongolia. This was very unpalatable to Chiang Kai-shek. Now, you have to remember that Chiang Kai-shek did not participate in the Yalta conference, and really, he was very angry about the Yalta conference. He thought that it was basically the Russians or the Soviets and the Americans deciding the fate of China behind his back, which was about right, actually, So he was not very happy with this, but he had no choice. So in the summer of 1945, he sent his trusted lieutenant, head of the executive yuan, Sun Tzu-wen, to Moscow to negotiate the Treaty of Alliance with China, which was done. And Chiang Kai-shek basically made this great concession. He granted Mongolia de jure independence, or at least the promise of de jure independence, following a referendum that was supposed to take place in Mongolia. Mongolians had to vote to show that they would actually support independence. So in practice, of course, nothing changed, because anyway, China had not had any control of Mongolia for so many years, but Chiang Kai-shek wasn't willing to give it up, right? He was a nationalist. He wanted to unite Mongolia with China. Now, though, there was no prospect of it, so he decided to give away Mongolia. What he got in return from Stalin was Stalin promised not to support Mao Zedong in the civil war, if the civil war broke out, or anyway, in general, not to support Mao Zedong. Which he didn't for a while. So that was the bargain between Chiang Kai-shek and Stalin. And then Mongolia had its referendum, which was completely fake. But, if we say it was completely fake, it doesn't mean that Mongolians, to the extent that Mongolians were generally quite anti-Chinese, and they remain so. There's actually a high level of anti-Chinese sentiment in Mongolia. Why is it Mongolia was part of the Qing Empire, and, just cultural interactions between Mongolia and China. This, but there is between Mongolia and live there, really sense that there's very anti-Chinese sentiment. Am I still there?
Yeah, there was a momentary pause. I think it's okay at the moment.
Yeah, is it okay? So just to recap what I was trying to say is that because of historical legacies, there has been obviously an anti-Chinese sentiment in Mongolia, which is sometimes difficult for the Chinese to understand and to realize. I mean, this is not something that is just China. Any big power, take Russia, take the United States, sometimes find it difficult to understand how much people, little countries around that great power, don't like them. Okay, that's a well-known phenomenon. You look to the outside, say, what's the problem with these people? Like the Russians look to their neighbors, like, why don't you love us? What's the problem? Same for China. The Chinese are like, we're so lovable. What is the problem here? But it turns out that, obviously, from the perspective of some of the smaller countries, this is not the case. So Mongolia, in any case, was very keen to remain independent. They held the referendum in 1945 and 1946. China ostensibly recognized Mongolia's independence. And then it's interesting, by the way, but in 1949, when Mao Zedong won in the Chinese Civil War and proclaimed the People's Republic of China, actually before the proclamation on October 1st, 1949, already from early 1949, there were talks between the Soviets and the Chinese, and they included conversations about what would happen to Mongolia. Mao Zedong wanted Mongolia reincorporated with China. He wanted to return Mongolia to China, and he would present this to Stalin, say, well, surely we want to have, those Mongolians, they want to return to the motherland. And Stalin said, no, you cannot. They have tasted independence. They're never going back. And Mao Zedong basically had to acknowledge that. But even after Stalin died and into the late 1950s, he still continued to pose this question. If you think about it, very late in the game, he continued to pose this question about Mongolia's independence, claiming that this was Stalin's mistake, that it was independent, that if it weren't for Stalin, it would still be part of China, which is correct. So Stalin, who was a hideous dictator and committed horrible atrocities and crimes, as far as Mongolia is concerned, has the interesting distinction of actually assuring Mongolia's political survival in the 1940s. For reasons that had nothing to do with this, good sentiment toward Mongolia. It was cynical geopolitical reasons, because Mongolia seemed like a huge, Stalin understood security in terms of territory. So to have a buffer like that between Russia and China was very important for Stalin, for the Soviet Union. Therefore, he insisted on Mongolia's independence. But obviously, the outcome of this is that Mongolia is independent, whereas any of those other, look at Xinjiang, look at Xinjiang, Stalin also supported the independence movement of Uyghurs, but then later abandoned them in Tibet, etc. So nothing like that happened. But in Mongolia, because of Stalin's interference, as it were, and his insistence on keeping this under Soviet control, Mongolia retained its independence from China for the remainder of the post-war period and into the present day. But it remained a Soviet satellite. It remained under Soviet control. It continued to build communism, which was a priori unrealizable, crazy idea, not, in a rural country like Mongolia, all the more so compared to even the USSR, which was a basket case itself. In any case, in the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union pursued political reforms, there was also a shift in Mongolia towards greater political openness. Basically, Mongolian political reforms paralleled Soviet reforms under Gorbachev. And by 1990, you had a pretty serious democratic movement in Mongolia, which led to peaceful transfer of power away from Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party and to the Democrats. Okay, so I will just a second turn. For the for the next, so this is the historical background. The next 30 years then sees Mongolia develop its democratic governance. Okay, how would we as a political system? It's a mixed system. There's a strong presidency, but also a strong parliament, and there are major parties that rotate in power. One of these parties, which is currently in power, is Mongolian People's Party, and of course, the name Mongolian People's Party is very similar to the previous Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, which was the respectively the Communist Party. So that in itself suggests continuity, and indeed there is continuity between the two because they just dropped the name Revolutionary from the title, but they are now Mongolian People's Party. But that doesn't mean that they're radical leftists or anything like that. Mongolian People's Party sees itself as somewhat on the left, central left party. They have been in power repeatedly, and they are probably the more the stronger political force in Mongolia. Now, on the other side, there are lots of other parties, but the other major party is a party called the Democratic Party, which has also come together as a result of a coalition of different various parties. And the Democratic Party has also been able to capture power on occasion, both in parliament and the presidency in particular. So if you look back at two of the recent presidents in Mongolia, President Batulak, who had just recently stepped down, and before him, President Elbegdorj, both were from the Democratic Party. And oftentimes in Mongolia, you have a situation where the parliamentary power was in the hands of the let's say the Mongolian People's Party, and the presidential power was in the hands of somebody who came from the Democratic Party. So there was actually sort of a checks and balances scenario in Mongolian politics, which in itself is kind of interesting, which of course led to deadlock a lot. We've got a question. So
I guess we can probably accumulate questions and address them at the end. But if
I guess I can.
In the chat, we can just, or if you want to address it.
Okay, I'll come back to this question. That's a very good question. Okay. That is a very good question. So anyway, we've got the Democratic Party, we've got the Mongolians. But what is remarkable about this? What is remarkable about this is the fact that we have had transition of power between these two parties. They go in, they go out. In recent years, we've had the domination pretty much of the Mongolian People's Party. Why is this? We can talk about that. It's primarily it has to do with quarrels inside the Democratic Party more than anything else. In general, Mongolian People's Party, I would venture to say that they have a more sensible economic policy. So while they're in power, the economy has done a little bit better than under the Democratic Party, but I wouldn't blame the Democratic Party necessarily. Sometimes they just face very difficult external circumstances. But what's more interesting about this whole thing is how they've managed to do that for 30 years, to have actual genuine elections. Not like Russian elections, right? Or not like Chinese elections that is to say no elections in the Chinese case, or the Russian elections, which are fake elections. But in Mongolia, you have actual real elections, which are not, of course, problem-free. No, don't get me wrong. I actually observed a number of Mongolian elections as a part of a monitoring mission of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and we found lots of problems. You can read our reports online. There were lots of problems, but the fundamental truth is that still you have democratic elections, and people have a choice. A genuine choice. There's genuine competition, and that is the whole thing. Genuineness of this thing, that it's not fake, that there is real choice. Why? How do you explain that? What makes it even more difficult to explain is that Mongolia doesn't really have the rule of law in general terms. Well, this is a contestable proposition, but what I would argue is that Mongolian courts are highly are under political influence. A lot of the time they're under political influence. There's, influence of various patronage networks and so on and so forth. So despite the fact that the court system is highly flawed, there's considerable level of corruption in the system. Mongolia is highly corrupt in various ways. At the same time, somehow you have been able to preserve this democratic rollover from administration to administration to administration, so that people are almost, and also there's open media. In Mongolia, like you don't see in China or in Russia. Basically, lots of newspapers, lots of television stations that openly participate in the political contestation, the political process. So really fascinating subject. I wrote an article with a colleague of mine from Mongolia a few years ago, where we analyzed this whole situation, tried to understand how Mongolian democracy survived. Our conclusion was that it has to do with the clientele networks that exist in Mongolia. And because in Mongolia, basically everybody knows one another, and every family has connections on all sides of the political spectrum. So through the democratic process works through these connections, through the clientele. And it's counterintuitive, because you would think clientele networks is something highly corrupt. But in Mongolia's case, it seems that it facilitates democratic transition, or at least change of administration. In other words, if, let's say, you're fed up with a political party, you can then invest your fortunes in a different political party, where you also have connections, as it were. You foster, develop those connections. So this way you can go back and forth. So that's just a theory that I advanced with my colleague Mendechar Kalsaihan. You can read this article. It was published a few years ago on the basis of our observation of Mongolian presidential and parliamentary elections over the last over one electoral cycle. So. So that brings me then to the final part of my discussion, or what I wanted to say, and that is how Mongolia has been dealing with its two neighbors, Russia and China. So Mongolia escaped Soviet influence in 1990, and after that, it was actually kind of blessed by the fact that the Soviet Union itself lost interest in Mongolia, and it was kind of just sort of withdrew. As the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia had no real incentive, no real ability to defend its interests in Mongolia. So it still maintained some joint enterprises, like the railroad. It had some, a joint copper industry in Mongolia that kind of continued to operate very dodgy schemes. But by and large, for Russia, Mongolia kind of lost its importance. And because of this benevolent neglect, Mongolia, actually, maybe it proved something of a blessing in disguise. But one way or another, Mongolia was able to free itself from under Russian influence, although cultural interest, of course, remains. Cultural attraction between Mongolia and Russia is much greater than cultural attraction between Mongolia and China, for example. So that, Russia still exercised considerable soft power, despite the fact that it basically withdrew from Mongolia, left it to its fate. At the same time, China, through because it was already, experienced high economic growth as a result of reform and opening policies, which were, of course, continued to drive China forward in the 1990s. China became more and more invested in Mongolia economically, and eventually Mongolia became extremely dependent on China in economic terms. So today, 90% of Mongolian export, 90%, think about it, 90% of export goes to China. It's a huge amount. So that is to say, China has a lot of leverage over Mongolia. I mean, it could almost do anything. It could just by shutting off this flow, it could bankrupt Mongolia in a week. Yeah, this is a huge power that China holds. Has it been willing to use this power is another question. And I would say generally China has been quite careful, but sometimes they have taken out the stick. One example will suffice. A few years ago, the Mongolian government invited the Dalai Lama, or rather, the Dalai Lama just visited Mongolia as a part of the connection between Mongolian Buddhist establishment and the Tibetan branch of Buddhism, and that caused huge wrath in Beijing. How dare they invite, the Dalai Lama? This must never happen. And China deployed the economic weapon, froze some financing. Mongolian government capitulated in just a few days and said, we will know. They apologized, we will never do it again, et cetera, et cetera. And they haven't done it since. So that is interesting. That was a few years ago. They may try again. Of course, obviously, there is a close connection. Dalai Lama is highly respected in Mongolia. There's close connection between Tibetan Buddhism and Mongolian in Buddhism, as I say, but that is an interesting example. So generally, China tries to see itself as some sort of somewhat benevolent force, but sometimes it cracks the whip. And when it does, Mongolia has no choice but to capitulate. So that's not an enviable position to be in, to have this kind of neighbor on whom you're dependent. And to the extent that you're not dependent on China, you're then dependent on Russia, because Mongolia has been taking much, for example, its oil supplies come from Russia. Energy imports in general basically come from Russia. So Mongolia is again highly dependent. If Russia turns off the tap, then Mongolia will find itself in a very difficult situation without that. So both countries actually have huge leverage over Mongolia. In order to balance the two, in the 1990s, Mongolia developed a new policy that was called the third neighbor policy. And this third neighbor, obviously Mongolia only has two neighbors, but the third neighbor stood for collective West, including the United States, Europe, but also India, South Korea, Japan. So-called democratic countries, or the democratic world, as it were, was Mongolia's collective third neighbor. And the idea was to balance off the Russia, China, and the third neighbor in economic terms. So, for example, by allowing investments from Western companies in order to offset dependence on the Russian capital and the Chinese capital. Now, this policy worked quite well for a number of years, but it has been coming under strain in more recent years. Why is this the case? There are a number of reasons. First, it's Mongolia's own fault, you might say. For a period of time, after Mongolia opened up itself to investment into its mining sector, Western mining companies have been trying to set up shops in Mongolia. Of course, the most prominent of these is Ivanhoe Mines or Rio Tinto, that has a large complex operating, extracting copper in Oyu Tolgoi in the Gobi Desert. But when Oyu Tolgoi was being established, there began this absolutely drawn out, very difficult struggle between the Mongolian parliament and the company over how much profit Mongolian government should be allowed to have. Now, because Mongolia is a democracy, you could talk freely about these things in the parliament, and obviously it's a populist issue. So there are few other things that are just as stirring for the public as the issue of for the foreigners coming to take our wealth, mineral wealth. That's like number one populist issue that everybody wants to hold on to. The other, obviously, is it's all being exported to China, so this is the other big evil. So because of that, because of this conflict, and because of this populist what was termed at that time economic nationalism or resource nationalism in Mongolia, a lot of foreign investors got cold feet and were not really keen on getting involved in Mongolia. And there were some other interesting examples, for example, with in relation to uranium exploitation in Mongolia, where a Western company was trying to get in, and then basically they were pushed out after investing millions of dollars into Mongolia. They were pushed out, and the manager of this company was found dead in his Ulaanbaatar hotel, etc. So there were all these nasty, things that were happening that basically turned investors away from Mongolia and made Mongolia less of an attractive destination for foreign direct investment. So this is one thing. But then another thing has a more of a geopolitical twist here. So China became much more powerful, much bigger player. It became much more difficult for Mongolia to act bypassing China. to bypass China, or Russia for this matter. So increasingly already this became evident under President Elbegdorj. It became very difficult for Mongolia to do anything really without getting their two main neighbors to agree to, or to be on board. One example of this is when Elbegdorj decided to proclaim permanent neutrality for Mongolia, much as, for example, Turkmenistan had neutrality. Well, effectively, Elbegdorj had to abandon this idea of proclaiming permanent neutrality because Russia and China did not agree to it. Especially Russia was very unhappy about permanent neutrality and pressured Elbegdorj to give up on this idea. So he did. Now, Elbegdorj was seen as something of a pro-Western politician. I don't think that this is necessarily the case. This idea came from the fact that he was partly educated in Harvard, although before that he was educated in the Soviet Union, so go figure. But in any case, Elbegdorj was seen as kind of savvy, pro-Western guy coming from the Democratic Party. The guy who replaced him, Batulak, was seen as basically Mongolia's Putin. He modeled himself on Vladimir Putin, and he really quite obviously turned to Russia. His first foreign trip was to Russia. He went to Vladivostok to meet with Putin. He would continuously meet with Putin during his years in power. So during that time, Mongolian-Russian relations became much tighter, much closer. Now, keep in mind as well that although Batulak was obviously leaning in the Russian direction, he was previously from the Democratic Party, but the Mongolian People's Party was already basically leaning in the Russian direction, even before. So as a result, the general tilt of Mongolia's foreign policy was in Russia's direction. But also there was an effort not to upset China. The outcome of this kind of situation over the last few years, and that has been increasingly obvious, is that Mongolian politicians have decided that it's better for them to simply, to really cash in on China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, to really try to serve as a bridge between Russia and China, and not to worry too much about the collective third neighbor. So there has been a retreat from this collective third neighbor policy towards much greater reliance on the two neighbors. So then this is the issue today. Will the third neighbor policy, will it survive? Especially given the lack of interest on the part of, first and foremost, the United States. In the United States, there has been in Congress a law that would allow Mongolia to export its Kashmir to the United States without some kind of taxes. It has been languishing in Congress for so long. Nobody really cares about Mongolia in the US Congress. Nobody really thinks in the United States that Mongolia is an important strategic platform, democratic state, potential democratic ally. And that's despite the fact that Mongolia participates in NATO missions in Afghanistan and Iraq, of all places. They actually put their soldiers on the ground. But basically, there's been kind of a neglect on the part of the West, thinking, Mongolia, it's locked between China and Russia. What can we do about it? Who cares? So let them just do their own thing. And so what we observe in the last few years, already under Elbegdorj, certainly under Batulak, is the third neighbor policy has basically deteriorated a great deal. There is increasingly an effort to just play Russia and China against one another, obviously engage with Russia because Russia is still seen, much as during the Soviet period, as Mongolia's ultimate protector against China. Because there's still this fear of China, there is fear of Chinese economic leverage, and there's a cultural fear of China. So in this context, you want to kind of rely on Russia to provide a measure of protection. So this is one aspect. But at the same time, you really want to engage with China economically because that's where the money is. And even President Batulak, for all his alleged anti-Chinese populism, which he aired early in his campaign for presidency, he became actually a very pragmatic president. So he did not try to quarrel with China or, what did he promise during his election campaign, he was very anti-Chinese in his orientation, but then once he became president, he was actually very pragmatic, trying to build trust with China. This policy has led to a breakthrough for Mongolia, and that breakthrough I don't know if this breakthrough will actually finally be realized, but at least on paper, it's there. For many, many years, Mongolian policymakers hoped that they would have corridors between Russia and China for oil, gas, electricity, cyber, the computer cable. Transport corridors, all kinds of communications corridors. They had hoped for the construction of those corridors, and especially, of course, for oil and gas, this was the key issue. And the Russians were not too happy about it. They had their own very difficult experience with Ukraine. When you have your gas transit, it's a lot of hassle. So Russians were not too keen to agree to this. And just recently, they actually did agree to this. They agreed to construct a gas pipeline that would just bring a lot of wealth to Mongolia, which would, of course, be astride of the transit route between China and Russia. In fact, the amount of gas that would pass through this gas pipeline would be greater, according to estimates, than it passes through the existing Power of Siberia pipeline that connects China and Russia. So you can see the bonus, the economic bonanza from close engagement with your two authoritarian neighbors. The question is, does that have political consequences down the road? What's going to happen if Mongolia becomes even more dependent on its neighbors? Will there be a moment when Mongolia is forced to move away from its democratic practices in order to satisfy its two neighbors? And I keep watching for that. I'm not seeing this. In fact, just a few days, in fact, I think yesterday, there was the Summit for Democracies in Washington, although it was virtual, but Mongolia participated in the Summit for Democracies. It was invited, and it participated. Now, in the context, as we know, of Russian and Chinese opposition to the Summit of Democracies. In fact, they wrote a joint op-ed. Russian and Chinese ambassadors wrote a joint op-ed condemning the Summit for Democracies and National Interest. You can read it; it's quite funny. In this context, having Mongolia, which is 100% dependent on its two neighbors, basically stick its head out and say, no, we still do what we want. We're a democratic country. We'll participate in the Summit for Democracies. Well, that's something, I think. And that indicates that there is actually, considerable hope for Mongolia in this regard. How much hope, I guess, depends on, whether you see the glass as half full or half empty. Okay, I'll leave it at this, and we can have a little further, discussion.
Okay, I think there were a couple of questions in the chat earlier. Maybe we can take those first. Let's see where this went. So one is, where'd it go? Can you see the chat questions? So do you think
yes.
Do you think the DP's lack of ability to bring in new leadership will lead to MPP domination going forward? That was the first.
So that is exactly right. The Democratic Party has had such a remarkable quarrel among themselves. I don't know why they're not able to consolidate their leadership, but there's been, I think, well, actually, I do know why this is the case. As we know, the Democratic Party itself was constructed, it was a product of different parties. So they kind of came together, really. As maybe part of that, as a result, you have these factions inside the Democratic parties, which are parties of their own. So you've got the Batul, or you had the Batulik faction, or the Altan Huyak faction, all those other factions. And they are at each other's throats all the time. So because of that, the party is highly unstable, and you can see how that has played into MPP political position, because the MPP somehow is much more able to have a consolidated core. That is despite the fact that MPP also has had their problems. And of course, there was a splittist party that split away from the MPP, the new MPRP, the New Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, led by former Prime Minister and President Ingbayer. But that's the only case of MPP having a quarrel kind of within itself. But generally speaking, they have been able to have a much more consolidated leadership. So I think that is an interesting question. Yeah, and the outcome of recent elections seem to suggest that MPP is definitely ascendant, definitely dominant. But of course, when the problem always is economic performance. If the economic performance peters out, or if, and of course, well, there's nothing there to peter out. Actually, Mongolian economic performance, because of COVID and various other things, have been quite, they've had all kinds of problems. So we'll see over the next electoral cycle what will happen. And if there's considerable, if there's a grave economic crisis or something like that, God forbid, then obviously MPP will face an uphill struggle. Possibly, I don't know. I don't want to make this prediction. So the second question, Monica, is, has Elbek Dorch been reintegrated back into the Mongolian politics? Yeah, I don't know what's happening with Elbek Dorch, frankly. I think, he is rested in glory. I'm not really following him all that much, so I don't know what to say to this. What do you think of the role of Japan and South Korea? So Japan has provided significant developmental aid to Mongolia, but has this translated into democracy promotion? I mean, the Japanese aren't really promoting democracy with their economic aid that much, right? They're not. So they are providing economic aid, that is true, and they are prominently there as part of the collective third neighbor, and South Koreans as well. Now, there are, of course, very close economic links between South Korea and Mongolia, and there's a huge Mongolian population living in South Korea. So there's actually a cultural connection there that works very well between the two countries. But I don't think they have been very particularly active, either of them, in terms of democracy promotion. But that just doesn't relate to Mongolia only. Just doesn't, the Japanese just don't have this. Won't you agree? I mean, they provide overseas developmental assistance, etc., things like that. But I don't think they have really a very strong political agenda in terms of, let's democratize or something like that. I haven't seen that with Japanese foreign policy, but that's just, I'm not a very close observer, but certainly the Japanese are not in Mongolia in this kind of sense as some American organizations have been. So, for example, the IRI, International Republican Institute, set up a shop in Mongolia, and they have been very active there. And obviously, there is an element of democracy promotion there. The U.S. Embassy has all kinds of programs like this. I'm not aware that the Japanese are doing this.
I have a question about the sort of economic dependence. I mean, you mentioned the 90% of exports going to China and the leverage that comes with that, and the whole third neighbor issue. And it seems, Mongolia is not the only country which deals with these sort of questions of sort of over-dependence on certain neighbors and the economic and security implications. I think there's, I forget who it was, somebody actually coined the concept of weaponized interdependence, I think, to describe the way that leverage gets used based on the economic ties. But it does seem that, given the nature of the Mongolian economy and some of the examples that you mentioned, that a lot of this is because of reliance on natural resources and other kinds of things where geography matters greatly for who one's trade partners are. I mean, are you seeing any efforts to build out more sort of service sector or other areas which might be less dependent on these geographic neighbors and maybe be able to diversify economically, sort of maybe higher end in the future to more long distance partners?
That's a great question. Of course, to the extent that there were this efforts, I think they have been brought to premature death with the pandemic. I mean, that has done. That has dealt a huge blow to the sector in Mongolia. I mean, Mongolia had a vibrant tourist sector. People would go there in hordes in the summer. Western tourists going out and doing stuff. That hasn't been happening for 2 years, and you almost wonder what sort of impact that has on Mongolia. I myself had not been there for 3 years, so already my knowledge of Mongolia is already not current in that regard, because I cannot, I haven't been able to maintain this sort of close connection which I had over the years by just going there every summer. You don't go there, you don't know what's going on. So, but the general tourist sector has certainly lost out a great deal from what we can tell. And so that leaves then what? Mining, of course. I mean, obviously, you've got the Kashmir, you've got the nomadic sector, as it were, I mean, the animals, animal husbandry, etc. But this is dwarfed by mining, by copper, gold, uranium to a certain extent, but coal, of course, Tavantolvoy is a major issue there. And who is going to buy your coal? Here's, by the way, an interesting anecdote. So we know, of course, that China and Australia have been quarreling for various geopolitical reasons, and China has been trying to penalize Australia by refusing to buy Australian coal. Well, what is less known is that Mongolia jumped into this opportunity and have been making a lot of money by selling coal from Tavantolvoy to China in place of Australia. So that's a very interesting situation. Yeah, I mean, Mongolia is also basically a democratic country, but they understand that here's a golden opportunity. So are they going to stick their head out and say, oh, we will criticize China for, I don't know, Hong Kong or Xinjiang or something? They will never do that. They will be, because they understand the limitations. So they have their own domestic, democratic politics, but they're also so highly dependent on China specifically. And what can you do? What else can you develop? What else can you develop in the absence of foreign interest in particular? So you've got, and even when foreign companies come into Mongolia and, obviously they just developed in that natural resources sector, where does this stuff go? It basically goes to China. Where else can the Russians always have this ideas about, oh, let's take it to Russia and then we will export it from Vladivostok somewhere else. But this is, mainly unrealistic. So all of this has been going to China. So I think there's just this economic dependency that is extremely difficult to overcome in Mongolia's case.
I see there's another question in the chat about South Korea.
Let's see. Okay, so we've had that we covered about South Korea. In which spheres Mongolia, Russia, and China have real tripartite cooperation? That's an interesting one. So a question from Victoria about a tripartite cooperation. That began really under Elbegdorch. It was Elbegdorch who came up with this idea of having summits on the sidelines of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where Mongolia is an observer. By the way, this has been a big issue whether Mongolia should join Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they haven't, although Batulak actually was trying to get Mongolia into it, but somehow they didn't join. Anyway, on the sidelines of this SCO summits, Elbegdorch proposed to have trilateral cooperation kind of summits between the leaders of the three countries. And that has been going on for quite some time. And that obviously raises Mongolia's status. And Mongolia has been trying to position itself as the key player in the idea of connecting BRI with Putin's idea of Eurasian economic integration, so Eurasian Economic Union. Or Eurasian Union. So Mongolia kind of wants to put itself into that role. Now, there's pressure from Russia, for example, for Mongolia to join the Eurasian Union. Mongolia has been resisting this kind of pressure, but they certainly want to be involved in economic schemes, like I said, various corridors. So, Victoria, when you talk about trilateral cooperation, that obviously it's the economic corridors that is the key thing here, and it is both a moment it's rail, obviously is key corridor, but the prospect of building multi-billion pipe is the next, is the El Dorado for Mongolian politics and that whole cooperation. Okay, so the next one, you've got Yugia. In September, the government of Mongolia announced that it upgraded its relation to South Korea to strategic partnership. What do you think the implication of that move by Mongolia? Mongolia is very partnership with various countries, much like China and Russia, and they have this various bizarre names, right? And their gradations. Partnership that Mongolia has is actually with China and Russia, and I think the United States is a strategic partner. South Korea being upgraded to strategic partnership. It's just something. It's just a signal interest. They're obviously interested in South Korea. They see South Korea.
I think Professor Radchenko may have been cut off. Let's wait a couple of minutes and see if he can get back on or not. If he can't, we'll wrap up, and let's wait a couple of minutes and see. Oh, there he is.
I thought that was it. Can you hear
Hi.
me?
Yeah, we can hear you. You're back. Yeah. Okay. I think that works. Yeah.
It's just that It's just connection is atrocious, and I apologize for that. I'm on network, so there we have.
I think
I don't know if there are further questions.
You were in the process of talking about South Korea, I think. I don't know whether you'd finished that question.
Yeah, so I was saying that South Korea is obviously seen an important partner, but I don't think it's nowhere near the importance that Mongolia attaches to China and Russia. For years, Mongolia tried to put itself as a party into six-party talks over North Korea, and advertised there was something called Ulaanbaatar dialogue, security dialogue, where they would try to talk about security issues for Northeast Asia and bring Korea into this as an important participant and player in the context, and maybe make Mongolia as a place for solving the Korean issue, as it were. But none of that actually worked out in any sense. There are some economic ties, obviously, and some investment by South Korean companies in Mongolia, but I don't think there is that Korea is out there to bail Mongolia out in any kind of sense. Korea is not that big of a player in this particular sense.
I see the next question is dare I say, a somewhat quirky question. You're being asked to predict reincarnation sites.
I can't see. Yeah, I cannot. Oh, wait. Let's see. I do. It has come back. Right. The next reincarnation of the Tao could be in Mongolia because of the historical connection with Tibet. Do you think there's any possibility of this happening, or will this more likely? I mean, if it does happen, this was one of the reasons that there was this falling out with China. If you remember, Monica, it looks like you're really following what's happening in Mongolia. But if you remember the last time the Dalai Lama visited, there was discussion of maybe they decided that there would be the next reincarnation in Mongolia, et cetera, et cetera. So it was all hush hush, rumor, and of course the Chinese got really upset over this and pulled out. Given what we've seen, I'm a historian, I cannot make this kind of prediction, but given what we've seen in Mongolia's increasing dependence on China, and also Mongolian government increasing reluctance to quarrel with China on a variety of issues, I doubt that they will allow something like this to happen, because to the prospect of the next Dalai Lama being in Mongolia. I mean, they will be, this would not be pleasant.
Okay, I guess I'll ask a final question. I mean, you mentioned soft power briefly, and sort of the ties between Mongolia and Russia versus China as well. I was wondering, is there any sort of difference in the social base within Mongolia of any sort of segments of the elite or sectors of the population which are more disposed towards Russia or China, or generational shift or anything like that? Are there any sort of fifth columns, as it were, for either side in Mongolian society?
Well, so generally, I would say the situation favors Russia. There was an anti-Russian sentiment in Mongolia early in the 90s, partially resulting from Russian military presence there and tensions surrounding that. Once that got out of the way, now Russia is generally seen as a welcome country for Mongolians. The fact that they now don't have a visa regime, which is something Mongolians have long worked on, have long hoped to have, has resulted in influx of Russian tourists, which of course now dried up because of COVID, but maybe will restart. And there's great, there's no, how would you put it? There's no fear of Russia at the social level in Mongolia. There's no fear that Russia will eat up Mongolia or integrate it. There is a fear of China at the social level. Look, it's everybody knows Mongolia is very anti-Chinese in this kind of is there a strata of the society that is pro-Chinese? No, it's universal. Everybody pretty much hates China. Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that. This is obviously, in the obviously, I wouldn't say it put it in quite in those terms, but I would say there's fear of China, and even those Mongolians who studied in China would go to China, study there, come back. I think still retain a kind of fear of China. So that is pretty clear. Now, in terms of other areas, there's obviously some of the some Western inclined Western educated Mongolians are much more open towards the West and would want to see greater involvement with the Third Neighbor Project on the part of the United States or European countries, which have not had any interest in it whatsoever. But there's definitely a large contingent of younger people who are Western oriented. There's a large contingent of younger people who are Korean, Japan oriented, especially Korean oriented, speak Korean, have studied in Korea, lived in Korea. And there is a small contingent of people who are kind of oriented towards Turkey, especially given that there is a considerable Turkish presence there through various government projects and the fact that in Western Mongolia there are of course the Kazakhs who kind of see themselves as Turkic in this kind of regard. So this is how. But I would say in general there is a. Would it oversimplify things if I'd say that in general there's a general anti-Chinese tendency? So I don't think that anybody in particular has particular close sentiments with regard to China.
Okay, we've got a bit over an hour, and we've been pretty lucky with the internet in the grand scheme of things. So maybe we'll wrap up at this point. But thank you very much, Professor Radchenko. It's been a fascinating talk about a country which probably doesn't get enough attention at HNC and SAIS. So this is, I think, a very interesting perspective that brings together the international relations aspect, domestic politics, society, and so on. So we hope to have you visit HNC at some point in the future when things get.
I would absolutely love that. I would love to do that. So thank you for listening, and enjoy your day or night wherever you are.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye.